coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. This is a guy who's a leader of this organization, Columbia University Apartheid Divest, which why can't these guys give anything a pretty name? I don't understand why this is so, it's such a logjam of terminology. But anyway, here's an Instagram post from these guys. We are Westerners fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization. We seek community and instruction from militants in the global South who have been on the front lines in the fight against tyranny and domination, which undergird the imperialist world order. Biplab Cholbe revolution must continue. Now, once again, I feel compelled to state, if you're an American citizen, Biplop Cholbe on, dude.
Yeah.
It's your right?
Right,
I mean,
right.
I don't agree with you, but you're allowed. If you're a green card holder, I'm sorry, there's no sort of gray area here that if we start worrying about immigrants and green card holders who want to totally eradicate Western civilization, then tomorrow, the FBI is going to be beating down your door for reading Marx or something. That's just not what we're talking about here.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the publishers and editors podcast at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books. I'm joined by Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and he's just reading poetry again. So he's once again poetry editor at the American Mind. And
it's my least favorite title. Nobody send us any poetry. I don't want it.
And you're Minister of Cultural Activity. There you go.
There you go.
Mike Sabo, managing editor of the American Mind, and author and journalist at large, Seth Barron. So we wanted to talk today about something very much on the news, the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, a former recent master's student at Columbia, got his degree in December, I think, who was on a student visa, and the Trump administration arrested him, or ICE did, to detain him and then deport him under the student visa. I think they were informed that actually he was on a green card now, no longer being a student, and they've kept him anyway, which I think they have plausible reason to argue. They have equal claim on deporting him for his un-American activities, his organization of a lot of the Tentifada stuff at Columbia, including blocking students from getting to class, all manner of non-speech expression, if I may tip our hand a little bit about what we maybe think of this. He had a hearing this morning at which he wasn't present. I think he's being detained right now in Louisiana, and his lawyers appeared. They're going to issue more arguments, and the government will respond, and we should have something more to chew on by Friday. But the usual suspects on the right and the left have piped up about this. The FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, is objecting to this. They're deploring what they characterize as the administration's punishing of someone, for a student or former student, for exercising his free speech, First Amendment rights. And then the left, of course, is raising the specter of a new McCarthyism / fascism, etc. Their normal talking points, dialed up more than usual, because the implicit threat behind this is to punish one of their big constituencies, which is left-wing anti-Israel types on campus and around the country. What do you all think? Is this a blatant violation of Mr. Khalil's First Amendment rights? Is it a prudent first salvo in the Trump administration trying to get a handle on this problem? Somewhere in between? What do we think?
I mean, I'm all for it. I'm not so sure that the Trump administration handled it in an ideal fashion. Typical of their shoot first and ask questions later. It seemed a little fumbled that he, in fact, was a green card holder and not just a student visa holder. However, emerged that even being a green card holder doesn't necessarily permit you to do anything you want. The law seems pretty clear about this. And in fact, the law is so clear that it seems to say that Secretary of State Rubio can, just on his own opinion, basically take away somebody's green card if they find them to be a threat to national security. And it's not clear that there's a lot of wiggle room. The funny thing is they had a hearing today, and it doesn't sound like much came of it, but afterward, his lawyers were saying, this is clearly just revenge or done out of spite. And besides, the law that they're appealing to is very rarely used. Well, that's not exactly like
the border laws. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of laws that doesn't mean it's not a law. One funny thing, I found an interview with him from last year where he was saying, I have to be very careful what I'm saying because there are immigration consequences to my activities. And there is a recording online of a legal clinic held by the CUNY, like this group at CUNY, specifically for the people doing these riots and all these actions, going specifically through the same laws that are being applied here and advising protesters, if they have like a green card or a visa, how to stay within the law. Basically, all of this indicates that the government's argument is totally valid, and they all know it. The protesters know it. They were advised to trim their activities to stay within the boundaries of what's actually pretty clear statute. So what I think is just so funny is that the Democrats are really seizing on this as a wedge issue, which I can't imagine it is. Like
much like the fired government workers they brought to the address last week. I agree, Seth, there were some unforced errors in how this was executed, something that Trump is prone to. And he did leave himself vulnerable to a number of the caricatures that they're often lobbed at him. But I also am with you that it does seem like this is an aspect of immigration law, which, though typically unenforced, is very much real and on the books. And I just want to point out that the reaction from the left, especially, has been effectively like first they came for the Stop Apartheid, Intifada, Hamas supporter, green card holder, Columbia students, then they came for the American citizens and stripped them of their First Amendment rights. And I just want to say I find that very telling, because if your conception of citizenship is that it's essentially on a sliding scale with the green card or with immigration or with permanent residency more generally, you really are saying the quiet part out loud. Like, the whole point of citizenship is that it is to citizenship, by definition, that the full complement of constitutional rights attach. And for who knows how many years now, the Democrats' position has essentially been that if you set foot in this country at any point, you are then entitled to what is effectively citizenship. And in fact, you're probably more entitled to citizenship because you earned it, right, by fighting your way here with the brave stance that you took. And it's just kind of a rude awakening, even for those of us that have opposed this point of view. It's kind of a rude awakening to just recall that none of that is true. That's just all a complete fabrication. And it might be how we've been enforcing the law up to this point, but it's not what the actual law is. And so the slippery slope argument to me is just completely unconvincing and also very revealing about how the people making it conceptualize American citizenship and immigration.
I think, like Seth said, I mean, this is clearly within the law. I think the Secretary of State has this power. It's under the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 237. And that allows the secretary to deport an individual if their activities compromise U.S. foreign policy interests. So, yeah, it rarely used, but like it's there. And I think in this case, it's clearly warranted. You look at all the connections this guy had, what he did, especially on campus at Columbia. I mean, it's like if we can't deport this guy, I think the U.S. is actually in pretty big trouble. And then it's kind of odd to me, too. You look at even some people on the right, Ann Coulter, who are, kind of on the other side of this, standing up for, this guy's First Amendment rights and everything. That's a bit odd. I mean, I know Ann's been kind of all over the place, kind of very against Trump and going back and forth. I think mostly probably very against Trump in some instances, or just highly critical of what the administration is doing, how they're doing it. But that kind of free speech, kind of over libertarianized, fire approach, I think that's just a dead ender. That's where the Republican Party was probably 10, 15 years ago. There's just no hope there for any kind of saving America or anything like that. I think with that approach, that's just kind of the dead consensus kind of stuff. So fortunately, in my mind, it's good that we're past that. And it's good that, we're taking threats like this seriously again.
Let's also just make sure to mention the nature of the views on under discussion here, because again, were this an American citizen, it would make no difference what sorts of views he were expressing. Right? I am enough of a free speech absolutist to say it's no argument against an American citizen's free speech that I find his views abhorrent. In the case of a foreign national, however, a major dimension of the law is considering the extent to which that national's speech compromises our foreign policy aims, it undermines American sovereignty or security worldwide. And this is a guy who's a leader of this organization, Columbia University Apartheid Divest, which why can't these guys give anything a pretty name? I don't understand why this is so, like, it's such a logjam of terminology. But anyway, here's an Instagram post from these guys. We are Westerners fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization. We seek community and instruction from militants in the global South who have been on the front lines in the fight against tyranny and domination, which undergird the imperialist world order. Biplab Cholbe revolution must continue. Now, once again, I feel compelled to state, if you're an American citizen, Biplop Cholbe on, dude.
Yeah.
It's your right? I
Right,
mean,
right.
I don't agree with you, but you're allowed. If you're a green card holder, I'm sorry, like that. There's no sort of like gray area here that if we start worrying about immigrants and green card holders who want to totally eradicate Western civilization, then tomorrow, like the FBI is going to be beating down your door for reading Marx or something. That's just like not what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And this guy, he wasn't just espousing these views. I mean, he was organizing blockades and shutting down campuses. And he said, the sky, yes, at first we want Columbia to divest, but then the sky's the limit.
It's Juneteenth and reparations.
Full
right?
on Biplop Cholbe.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should add too, I bring it up. We have not really confirmed this yet, but it is being reported. And it's interesting given our discussion of USAID and all this sort of stuff and soft power and American ops abroad. But the Middle East Eye, which was flagged by Jack Posobiec on Human Events, reports that Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian Columbia University graduate detained by U.S. immigration authorities over the weekend, worked for the British government on its flagship soft power policy for years. He previously worked as a program manager at the Syria office in the British Embassy in Beirut from 2018 to 2022. Online records reviewed by MEE show that Khalil worked as a local manager for the Syria Chevening program, a prestigious UK government international scholarship scheme, as well as for the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. Former British diplomat Andrew Waller, who was a policy advisor at the Syria office while Khalil worked there, told ME that the U.S. government's depiction of Khalil was false and defamatory. He went through a vetting process and was cleared to work on sensitive issues for the British government. It's outright defamation what Trump has done. He was loved by his colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. But this was the fun thing for me because it shows we've talked before about the transatlantic sort of managerial classes, left of center and even farther left, kind of schemes and money flows and organizational arrangements. The Chevening Scholarship, which is funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, describes its mission as being to support UK foreign policy priorities and achieve FCDO objectives by creating lasting positive relationships with future leaders, influencers, and decision makers. So it shows the what's that stupid word from managerial productivity speak? It shows the synergy between the ruling classes across the Atlantic that they consider this sort of thing a good thing to fund. whoever may be doing it, and however nice Mahmoud may be to his colleagues over in the UK, it's basically Western civilization financing its own destruction, and it's good to be rid of it.
Oh no, the UK is a country where, like, okay, an Afghan asylum seeker is convicted of a sex offense, and then they want to deport him, but they can't deport him because he's a sex offender, and he'll get in trouble there. So, I mean, if, I don't know if I trust their vetting.
Well, we'll follow the case closely, but I want to bring up an old argument to push back a little bit against Spencer on his free speech absolutism. We mentioned it maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago on the podcast. But so back in the day, Harry Jaffa, who was a Jew from Brooklyn, there was the case of the was it in Indiana? I forget, the Nazis marching in Skokie,
Illinois.
Illinois, thank you. And Jaffa's argument was like, look, a country can tolerate this sort of thing, especially when it doesn't rise to the level of a real threat, but they're under no obligation to tolerate it under the First Amendment. In other words, you don't have to tolerate even citizen groups that are arguing for the overthrow of the government and the destruction of your civilization. And that abstracts completely from arguments in recent years by, say, or dissents really from folks like Justice Alito that something, the modern equivalent of the Nazis burning a cross on your lawn or even marching in your town amounts to kind of assault. Now, everyone gets worried about this, especially on the right, because at some future date, perhaps not too long from now, the side in power will be the other side, and they'll get to define speech as they see fit and enforce this new precedent against you. And those are all valid concerns. Maybe they're reason enough to be more or less free speech absolutists, but we shouldn't concede the principle, which is you don't have an unlimited right to speak in this country, even if it's just speech of a certain flavor. None of this rises to that level. It's much easier, made easier by the fact that he's a foreign national. I should say, though, that his wife is a citizen. I don't know if that complicates things at all. Maybe only in a procedural way.
Good question.
We'll have to follow it.
Yeah. Well, it's like what Tom Homan said. No, it's not family separation because the family can be deported too.
Yeah, but they can always go with him.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Interesting, Ryan. There are, I guess, two separate issues, only one of which I suppose I was addressing with my Biplab Cholbe on slogan. I guess the point I was making there is that the speech disgusts me and that I don't think that's particularly relevant. There's all sorts of speech that disgusts me, some of which is conduces to dismantlement of our civilization. But yeah, there's a separate issue, which is that in this case, he's actually advertising the wondrous benefits of taking apart the American nation and the civilization around it brick by brick, which is famously a hard problem for all free speech theorists. Chesterton's thought that stops thought. And as you say, even then, we're not really dealing with those issues in this case, but that is a much bigger set of questions. And everybody implicitly knows that there's some kind of conundrum to be dealt with there. I mean, even people like me who call themselves free speech absolutists also say, in my case openly, in some cases when pressed, that there are points of view, especially when kind of advanced en masse, that would so destroy or undermine the very structures that enable free speech that they can't meaningfully or comprehensively be included within the concept of free speech. But this is like now we're going to get nerding out about the part where John Stuart Mill says that you can stop a guy from walking off a bridge on Liberty, which is beyond the scope of this particular discussion.
Yeah, all good points. Well, we should transition to the second thing we want to talk about today, which is, so some of people, including on this podcast, have never heard of Ian Carroll, who recently appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I wanted to raise this larger issue because a lot of our friends and supporters of various stripes have raised this sort of thing recently. So I wanted us to talk it through and see what we kind of make of it and how we assess it. And that is the rise of a kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, just asking questions, anti-Semitism of recent years, especially on social media and on X and maybe in the podcast environment. So Ian Carroll was on Joe Rogan saying, well, Joe, you know who funded the Schofield Bible? and modified it with bad messaging was the Rothschilds. And he's just one small example. Carroll was really nowhere on my X feed to speak of until maybe 8 months ago, maybe 15 months ago, where he built a large following doing these, hold the phone or basically phone recorded vidcasts with interspersed articles that he points to and basically tracing somewhat conspiratorial musings about who was funding what on the right or left, was funding or squelching disinformation campaigns. What should we really think about X, Y, or Z historical event? And now he seems to have made his big debut publicly on Joe Rogan, casting aspersions at the Rothschild family and the nefarious influence of various rich Jews across history. There's Tucker kind of soft pedaling or giving a pretty soft interview to the prime minister of Qatar not too recently, which would cause some consternation amongst fans of Tucker's. How should we regard all this? I mean, the thing I would tell people on the right broadly who raise grave concerns about the rise of this sort of thing on the right is that the constituency for it politically in America is virtually nil. So that's one reason not to worry too much about it. A lot of it online is it's like the teenage version of pissing off your parents. So a certain flavor of right-wing dissident on the right, I guess, or just a dissident from the current orthodoxy of the left, loves to piss everyone off, and some low-hanging fruit to do that is to traffic in low-grade and half-baked anti-Semitism of various flavors. Some mother, left-of-center mother, months and months ago on Twitter was expressing deep concern that her 14-year-olds in the back seat thought Hitler jokes were funny. There's a bit of that, just sort of rebellion for rebellion's sake. Yeah, there are real anti-Semites out there of all flavors, so we need not soft pedal it completely. But what are we to make of this? Is this my last data point actually with Ian Carroll is the kind of nature of the audience he was attracting and a lot of the self-discrediting stuff he was purveying before going low-grade Rothschild hating always seemed to me to be an op. So if I were the left or George Soros or whomever, I think I would let 1,000 of these flowers bloom on the right and encourage them. I'm not saying I have any proof that Ian Carroll is an op, but this sort of thing cropping up at opportune times seems suspicious to me. There, I've dabbled in my own little bit of conspiracy theorizing, but what do we make of all this?
Just to talk about just the Schofield Bible and that kind of thing. I mean, so you look at that translation. I mean, that's the KJV. So C.I. Schofield added a bunch of different commentaries and all that kind of stuff. I think that was the first one that had that much commentary extra than the biblical text since the Geneva Bible. That was 1560. Schofield Bible, the first edition, I think came out in 1909. It was revised in 1917. And I think that 1917 version is kind of the main version used today. No evidence it was funded by the Rothschilds. And it looks like, as far as I was able to find, two gentlemen, Alwyn Ball and John T. Peary, who were basically members of the Plymouth Brethren dispensationalist group. So dispensationalism is it's a certain, I would say probably more modern view of Christianity, how to interpret the Old and the New Testament, how to see the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, the state of Israel, that kind of thing. So that gets off into other deep waters. But yeah, I mean, I've been seeing this kind of stuff too, just things that have no basis in fact. And I think you don't want to, nominate a William F. Buckley and throw out the John Birchers. But at the same time, look, you want to seal yourselves. You want to speak the truth. You want to know what you're talking about. You want to do the reading, and you just don't want to spew lies and nonsense. So I think this is just kind of a character check on us as the right. We're the people of, supposedly character, virtue, etc. I mean, we need to kind of back that up and just make sure what we're reading, what we're listening to filter all that stuff out and be spreading, what's actually good and true and beautiful and not garbage.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I would be okay with people just asking questions if they were interested in hearing an answer. But they're really not. I mean, I was thinking, every anti-Semite that you hear about or talk to will claim that they have some core value. Like maybe it's defense of Christianity, patriotism, just caring about decency, hating pornography. But then once you see how they use all of those things and abuse them just in the service of leveraging their argument, such as the Schofield Bible, well, then you find out that their only core value is anti-Semitism. they just work backwards from that. So, like Ian Carroll, I guess he was talking about how Netanyahu in 1995 wrote in a book that Muslim terrorists, they want to destroy the World Trade Center. And Ian Carroll makes like a whole meal out of this. He's like, isn't that seems a little suspicious that he's onto this so early? And it's like, well, yeah, except 2 years before that, they did try to blow up the World Trade Center. So it's like he doesn't even I don't know if he even knows what he's talking about. Similarly, like Candace Owens, who used to seem like at least kind of factually based, has now just gone off into, like, she says that there's no such thing as a blood libel because it is a fact that Jews routinely murder Christian babies around the time of Easter Passover. So it's a libel to even call it a blood libel.
It's, really makes you think. That's good.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, raising questions is fine. But the thing is, all these questions have been answered. They're just not interested in the answer.
Right. We've been over this. I mean, my meta level sort of structural assessment of this trend has kind of always been that this is the wages of ruthlessly enforcing a false cultural narrative, and that really you create the breeding ground for this venom by doing what the cultural establishment has done for my whole lifetime, which is actually to forbid the asking of questions about certain taboo subjects. And certainly the Marvel movie heroes and villains narrative about 20th century industrial great power warfare is a good example of this because, again, in my own assessment, in order to excuse and downplay the fact that many Western intellectuals had been sweet on Stalin for way longer than was in any way morally acceptable, we created a story about the 20th century in which basically the only villain and the apogee of evil was Hitler and the Holocaust, and no other industrial level crimes occurred. And so the Gulag was just like kind of written out of my high school history experience in a way that was truly shocking to me when I eventually read Solzhenitsyn and kind of figured out what had been missing from this picture. And this is emblematic of a whole set of principles that are just like not amenable to nuance in your kind of average lib's brain and in the environment that a lot of us grew up in, which then creates a scenario where just asking questions really is kind of transgressive and virtuous. And some of these things that will get you treated as a pariah, like saying, well, was Hitler the only villain of World War II? Right? There are things that you can say in that environment that will get you treated as a pariah that are nevertheless actually legitimate modes of revisionism in that climate. You create that scenario, and then you give moral legitimacy to anybody, any half-cocked, cockamamie, harebrained trash dweller who comes along with, as Seth is saying, these totally baseless and unsubstantiated eyebrow-wiggling allegations about conspiracy theories that have been kind of like actually debunked by legitimate and non-cringe people century upon century. And now you have this environment. Well, just because you want me to provide evidence that the Rothschilds control the weather, that just makes you just as bad as all these gatekeepers that I grew up with in school. So it really is like they really did screw us over, the cultural left, by creating this environment. And on top of all of that, having said all of those sort of mitigating circumstances for why somebody otherwise well-meaning might get like led down the primrose path into some of this really ugly and wacky stuff. Also, anti-Semitism is like diabolically sticky. It suffers, of course, from the epistemic closure that all conspiracy theories do, where every piece of counter evidence is folded into like a no true Scotsman theory or some kind. There's some way to explain away every counter evidence from within it. But also maybe because it is like the ultimate conspiracy theory and has such an enormous and voluminous history in Western civilization, there's just like endless cultural resources, if you want to, for portraying anti-Semitism as trad or like too cool for these fake con ink rhinos or whatever. And so people get stuck circling this drain. And it all makes me, I have to confess, extraordinarily black-pilled and depressed, because the people that get caught in this loop, some of them, at this point, there's no love lost between me and Candace Owens, right? Like, that's a lost cause and I don't lose sleep over it. But then the young guys that circle around the edge of the vortex, you just want to say to them, man, like, this is a path to becoming a deranged, embittered, hateful little lizard. And there's just like no way out of it once you get in there, unless somebody like smacks you upside the head, which is maybe what fathers are supposed to be for.
Let me just throw in the other funny thing about it is what they kind of get really, they sort of fetishize the idea that they're not allowed to talk about it, and that talking about this will lead to their immediate cancellation, and that becomes like virtually half of their evidence, even while they're talking about it.
Yes, which has always been this hilarious feature of cancel culture, is that two things can be true at once. A, there really was cancel culture. There is still, to some extent, cancel culture in which saying perfectly legitimate things could get you hounded out of your employment. People did terrible things during the peak of 2020 spirit. A, that is true. And B, another thing that will cause people to catcall you and laugh you out of town and jeer at you and tell you to sit down and shut up is if you're being a total ass and an idiot. And this is something that the left would often say in defense of their own really egregious cancellations. But that doesn't mean it's not true. And so you can then just say like make these deranged claims about like, they never taught me in school about the Dresden bombings. Like, what were they keeping from us? It's like, no, I just sat next to people like you in school the whole time and you were scrolling your phone. And then afterward, you told me you didn't get the teacher's teaching style and you were like, can I copy your notes? That's the level of intellect that we're dealing with here. And then they say like, oh, why didn't anybody ever tell me? It's like, you probably were like out to lunch or playing hooky. Anyway, all that to say, exactly, like the fact that cancel culture exists then becomes this reason for like why everybody thinks that you're a toad, but maybe you're just a toad.
It brings a business idea to mind. Someone could have a lot of fun with a tongue firmly in cheek, new volume, Antisemitism for Dummies. To sell at your local Barnes and Noble.
This is related to one day I want to write a book about Christian heresies and give it the title "We've Been Over This." And I feel that like Marcionism would be one of them, this thing which is now very current. I mean, I think it's related to the dispensationalism stuff, Mike. The Marcionite heresy is now back in a big way. That the Old Testament, not the same Bible as the New Testament.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I can definitely see that. And just thinking up to something else that going along kind of with Spencer's observations on cancel culture, there's like certain books that come out like, oh, here's the truth. Not even about anti-Semitism, Thomas DiLorenzo's The Real Lincoln. You're going to learn the truth. And then it's like, you don't even need to read it. You just need to show a picture of yourself holding it up. Oh, there you go. You have the truth. And it's just like, what are we getting into? And I understand tribalism is a part of politics, but I mean, it's just such surface level kind of stuff these days. It's just insane. It's like, oh, I love this guy. Have you ever read anything from him? No, but I have his picture in the background of, my shot. Okay, great. I mean, it's just, yeah, the surface level lowest common denominator stuff. I'm just seeing that just constantly these days.
There's the old quip about Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind. Of course, having nothing to do with Antisemitism for Dummies. but it was the book that made him rich. Millions of people bought it, but it was like the book that you should have had on your shelf. But, the percentage of people that actually read it, probably more like 20 or 30%.
That's that sweet spot, baby. You want that book that people buy as a token of their intellectual
of course.
broad mind.
Yeah. As you're collecting royalties, what do you care if people actually read it?
Please read. Who does that anymore? I just feed it to Grok personally.
Yeah, you can console yourself with the lack of every purchaser of your book being enlightened by it by building your vacation house with the proceeds.
Precisely so. Yes. And then I can write more brilliant books that they can not read, because I don't have to worry about the money.
All right. Well, we wanted to talk about Gavin Newsom. My wife insisted we talk about Gavin Newsom, but I was inclined to anyway.
I'll do anything for Amelia. I would die for her. I'm ready.
Thank you, Spencer. We talked maybe a month ago or so about the left discovering the problem of populist right-wing podcastery and lamenting the fact that they didn't have their own Joe Rogan. And who was that first candidate they were trying to gin up? You know his name, Spencer.
Yeah,
Hassan Piker.
Hassan Piker. Thank you.
If that dude doesn't post hog in the next 6 months, I'll eat my hat. Sorry to get sidetracked, but he is on a trajectory that only ends with nudes. That's all I'm saying.
I see. You can inform us about
I'm not wishing
have to observe it.
To be clear, this is not like I'm not speaking my intention.
No, I understand.
Universe or whatever. Just like
you're just identifying the man's descent. Yeah, I understand. Well, it's clear that Gavin Newsom got the message, and he's decided he will be the next Joe Rogan. At least that's how I'm reading his new-ish, slickly produced podcast, on which Charlie Kirk appeared and Steve Bannon just appeared. And those of us, especially Californians, who've known Gavin at least as a political animal for a long time, and we've brought this up on this podcast before, you all are playing with fire. It may be good for clicks, but he's one of the slicker, more mellifluous and skilled politicians out there. He's clearly angling for a run in 2028. Obviously, he was recently, I forget where he did it. Spencer will know, but he was, just saying that, we got to have some sanity on the left on this trans stuff and girls and women's sports. And he got, of course, a raft of crap for it from his left and a good portion of his party. But he's positioning himself, everyone, and he is a dangerous man and a dangerous political animal with a lot of talents. And our friend and sometimes colleague Peachy Keenan said, look, you don't cozy up to this guy. It's going to be bad for everyone. Can't we be rid of him? You should just ignore him. Or at the very least, if you go on his show, don't let him kind of whitewash himself. That wasn't Peachy's term. That was a great term from Lulu Maservi on Twitter, saying, he's just whitewashing his history. And she cited as an example Charlie Kirk saying, well, you shut down the state and the schools for 2 years. And Newsom parried it by saying, it just shows you're having an impact, man. And then they both sort of laugh. Charlie has an impact, and Newsom couldn't get away with it. Ha, ha, ha. And Charlie goes, yeah, oh, thank you. But just kidding, and it's all sort of breezed over. Peachy's point is you either ignore him or you go on a full frontal assault of confronting Newsom's failed state and his terrible management of it, his incipient authoritarianism, and his left-wing radicalism, and make him own all of those, or at least try to defend them. That the worst thing you could do would be to humanize him and kind of let him skate past a lot of this stuff, because it will come back to bite you.
This reminds me, there's a phrase that used to be kind of a stock phrase. I don't know if it's all that current anymore, but a strange new respect, which they used to apply when a right winger would say something bad about the Patriot Act or something. You'd have a major figure who would criticize the right from the left and would kind of position himself as this principled, sensible, moderate within the Conservative Party. And all of a sudden, the New York Times would be running these glowing profiles on the guy. It's like a strange new respect for Mitch McConnell, for John McCain, whoever, somebody whom previously they had done nothing but excoriate. Every column, every article had been negative. And the joke was always that the minute this guy runs for president or tries to gain any power for his own points of view, he will instantly be back out in the exterior darkness where there is great wailing and gnashing of teeth. That people are tempted by inclusion in the smart set, in the kind of cool club. They like to be written up favorably. And it does. Nobody wants to get attacked in the press all the time. And so when the left owned the press, right wingers were always catering to them, hoping to get some scraps dropped from the table and telling themselves that this was going to be useful for them politically in one way or another. But of course, it never was when it actually came time to vote for things. That's not quite what's going on with Gavin here, but it is analogous. There's this right-wing ecosystem now, which, as Ryan said, everybody wants in on. It's clearly the hot new thing, and it's been building and building, and now suddenly this whole media ecosystem, the Rogans of the world, the bro podcasts, and the manosphere, and the Roundtable, we're of course fielding media requests left, right, and center. We can't turn them down fast enough. But this is now the hot new thing. Maybe they're going to make Hassan into the kind of counter programming for it. I still think that might actually work. I'm most afraid at a media level of Hassan Piker because he's so talented, and he's like at the Mahmoud Khalil level of like tear down Western civilization. But anyway, Gavin is now trying to gain a strange new respect among conservatives to the extent that he wants to sort of gesture toward this moderation. And conservatives were like Charlie Brown and Lucy with the football. Like, we hate people like Gavin Newsom so much, and we're so appalled at their extremism that we don't ever imagine that they can also be smart, intelligent operators. Like, you go on Facebook and you listen to the boomers, and they're like, I don't understand how these idiots ever get to a position of power. Well, it's like, well, because they're not actually idiots. They're sinister lizard people who are exceptionally good at sociopathically wearing the skin suit of somebody reasonable and intelligent, which is precisely what you are now watching Gavin Newsom do. So, right, some way or another, we have to not let him do that, whether it's by like shoving his record down his throat or by just ignoring him altogether. But if we start swooning for him like lovesick teenagers that got looked at by the handsome, popular guy in school, it's bad mojo.
No, I completely agree. I mean, we have to take this guy seriously. You can't platform him and somehow turn him into, the Dems 2028, moderate candidate. I mean, which is insane, but it seems like the right, for some reason, kind of wants that to happen. And I think that the people, Charlie Kirk, Steve Bannon, I mean, they're smart guys too, but I think you really do run the risk of just kind of normalizing this guy. I mean, how about and Peachy had this post too. How about you go on his podcast and you ask him, why did you conspire to cover up Biden's dementia? Did you ever discuss his dementia or cover up with anyone? How many illegals are in California? More questions. How about the California fires? What policies led to that? Do you take any responsibility for that? So I think that strategy would be good, but you have to be very careful with this guy. He's been in politics for a very long time. I mean, I'm remembering, his back and forth, the debate with Ron DeSantis. I mean, he did, I thought, very, very well. And this is just a guy, I think, you kind of have to keep at arm's length. And you just have to be very, very careful.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting, how it reflects this vacuum in the Democrat Party right now. I mean, I guess they have who's leading them? Like, they asked Tim Walz, well, who is the leader of the Democrat Party now? And he kind of hemmed and hawed, and then he was like, well, the voter, the American people are in charge of the Democratic Party, which, doesn't mean anything. But then, they are trying to they're trying to find somebody. I saw Tim Walz, he's got somebody pushing this line that the problem with the Harris campaign was that they didn't center Tim Walz or feature him hard enough, which just seems like ludicrous to me. I mean, it seemed like he was like millstone from the beginning. But
it's so close. It's actually the opposite of that. Having Tim Walz at all. Like that
But
ballpark. You're in the area. Yeah.
The problem with the Democratic ticket was the bottom of the ticket and the top of the ticket.
Yeah, right.
And the optics and the political environment and the Democrat Party. Yes.
But I guess they're looking for somebody, and Gavin Newsom, I guess he's as good as any on their team. Yeah. To me, it doesn't look like they have much of a bench. I mean, they have Pete Buttigieg for Senate. He's running for Senate in Michigan. Tim Walz, Kamala Harris, maybe run for governor. I don't know. It's kind of fascinating how completely adrift they are. And we're getting on it's like almost 6 months after the election.
Right. The dust should have settled at this point, for them to be able to see clearly enough and kind of regroup. As you're talking, I'm thinking, what about that Shapiro guy that they turned down for the VP pick with Kamala, which puts me in mind of a Variety article I just saw about the new Snow White movie, which, bear with me, they're walking back the premiere.
Yeah.
And Variety says it's because of the controversy over Rachel Ziegler, who's Snow White, and Gal Gadot, who's the queen and formerly known as Wonder Woman, this Israeli actress, absolute bombshell. The least plausible premise of the movie is that Gal Gadot is upset about Rachel Ziegler being hotter than she is. But the movie has generated controversy, thanks in part to the Daily Wire, because Ziegler is not even a leftist. She's just kind of like a reflexive. She's saying the things that her chat GPT brain like tells her she has to say about how Disney princesses are oppressed and so on and so forth. So there has been controversy about that. Gal Gadot has said zero controversial things. There's absolutely nothing controversial about Gal Gadot unless could it be? Is there one thing that perhaps Disney is a little worried about relative, right? I mean, she's Israeli. They can't say this, but it's like, so okay, you're in Hollywood and you find Jews controversial. How's that gonna work out for you? It's like this similarly with the Democrat bench. It's making me think like, okay, so you can't really like you're looking for somebody smart, talented, left-leaning, like presentable, clean-cut, religious, eloquent, and also it can't be a Jew based on your face. It's like, I just like the math is not mathing.
Well, but Spencer, remember, Mark Ruffalo and his friends' pin of choice at the Oscars was the bloody fist, which has now been transformed into somehow an avatar of pro-Palestinian sentiment. But of course, the image itself was the bloody fists of a man who just beaten a Jew to death and showed his bloody fist to a crowd. So, I mean, it's,
Exactly, right. It's like if
yeah,
that's not controversial, but the hottest woman alive
yeah,
who
yeah,
also is Israeli in your
yeah. No, I
movie is
take
a
your point.
problem. Yeah, yeah. That's
The
the whole bit. Like, it's the fact that they are so in hock to, like, this tiny elite sliver of, like, murderous psychopaths. Like, this is, like they stay being on the 20% side of every 80/20 issue, and this is one of them.
Yeah, just an indication of how the new hot thing and has gone mainstream. That is right wing podcastery. I'm stealing this point from a friend who I would credit, but I didn't ask him ahead of time. But he watches this stuff more closely than I do. But he said that Danny McBride went on Theo Vaughn's podcast, so it's clear that Hollywood, like this is like a
Yeah.
Hollywood PR circuit now to go on right wing populist podcasts. So that's the environment into which Gavin Newsom is stepping. It would be interesting to see his ratings so far. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it before, but it looks to be a fairly brand spanking new venture of his. And the second point from the friend, which I'll also steal, which because I thought it was good, and people should contemplate it. Is this the new? Well, is this whole ecosystem in the media going to replace the old Sunday show sort of variety show rollout? Maybe it'll just be a part of the rollout for any big feature now that it's part of your media circuit to do this. It would make sense. It's a growing audience, and it's a way for Hollywood to broadcast their wares to a right-leaning audience that may be young, which are consumers of movies. So it makes
And
total sense.
it fits beautifully with my theory that in 2 years, we're gonna see all the projects that are now, as we speak, getting greenlit, and they're gonna movies are suddenly gonna become based or at least not cringe and crazy because these things actually like because the so-called vibe shift was so abrupt and because Hollywood actually works on like a 1 to 2 year lag in the same way that we're still living with the hangover of the Biden economy into Trump's first jobs report. We just watched the Oscars that were still suffering from the hangover of the Biden years and 2020. So the bloody fists and the maundering speeches and all the stuff they did kind of try to keep a lid on, but still came peeking up. It's like that is kind of the one rollover from that era, and perhaps soon we'll see the movies that are being made to appeal to the Theo Vaughn crowd, which could be really fun.
Yeah, it's a brave new world we're living in. Well, we're almost up on time, but does anyone have any recommendations? I was
Yes.
joking about it with you, Spencer, before. No, it was on our weekly meeting this week, you and Mike I've now like 4 episodes in. This provisional judgment, but actually for a certain type of listener to this podcast with certain tastes, I will preface it with that. fans of Dune, Max, that is HBO's online streaming services, prequel to Dune, which features the founding of the priestesses, the Bene Gesserit. So far, pretty good. Well shot, well acted, and fun if you love Dune, if you're a fan of Dune.
What's that show called?
Good question. Let me look it up so we can properly plug it. Again, provisionally, it may turn terrible, but
I have also enjoyed it. Dune, apparently my favorite intellectual property in the entire world. I didn't think I liked Dune, but over the course of several episodes of this podcast, I've realized I know like all the lore. And the show is pretty good.
It's called Dune Prophecy, Seth.
Oh,
Dune
okay.
Prophecy. Ryan, first of all, I have
Yeah,
to say
it's-
I finally watched episode 1 of Mythic Quest, which I think was one of your previous recommendations, and you've been trying to get us to watch it. Hilarious. You were totally right. I'm entirely hooked. And it's
I knew
like,
you would like it, Spencer.
yeah, it's like it's catnip. It's the Philadelphia, Always Sunny in Philadelphia guys. It's like RPGs. It's office workplace comedy. But having established my pop culture bona fides, I have an actual like hoity-toity recommendation for people.
Culture? Excellent.
Culture. Yes, not culture, but culture. I am teaching Roman literature at New College, Florida this semester, which has been a delight. Generally, I'm a Hellenist by trade. That is, in grad school, I did Greek literature, and that sort of took me away from my first love, which was Latin literature. In high school, that's how I got into ancient languages and ancient literature and all the stuff that would eventually become kind of my grad school career. And so it's been this awesome opportunity to kind of rediscover that whole world and that whole history, and to think every day about the Roman Empire as men are supposed to do, and to do so kind of with a much more developed set of critical tools than I had the last time I read this material, because I've been through several kind of iterations of like graduation since last time I was engaging with this stuff. And finally, this week, I've come back around to my first ever Latin poet, the first poet I ever translated in any serious way, and that's Catullus. Catullus is a late Republican poet. We think around 84 to 54 BC, and he's often given to school kids because he's kind of a sampler pack. He's like a grab bag. He wrote a bunch of different poems, most of them short, none of them epic length, and of all different genres in imitation of the Hellenistic poets who did something very similar. Guys like Theocritus and Callimachus, he's kind of bringing that into this Roman world. And what I guess I never realized about him until just this time around is that because he's a late Republican poet, he's living in the midst of epochal social crackup. I mean, Marius and Sulla have just fought their civil war. An army has been marched, a Roman army has been marched upon Rome for the first time pre Julius Caesar. The bloody prescriptions which Plutarch describes, these are like, political kind of persecutions, which Plutarch describes as causing Rome to run red with blood. And imminent, although not yet happening, the triumvirate and the final civil wars and the transition into the empire. So it's kind of amazing that in the midst of this, you get this guy who sounds effectively like a character from Brideshead Revisited. Like he is just joshing his friends in these really puerile ways about their sexual proclivities on one moment, and then the next moment he's sort of like citing these erudite, obscure poets and writing these incredibly intricate little mini epics. And so he's just clearly like one of the most cultivated men in the world of his day, pursuing a form of literary escapism, but also, I think, like engaging with the late Republican social crackup and decline in all these amazing ways. Anyway, Catullus is just like awesome. There's a lot of good translations out there of him that I'm using in my class, the Oxford World's Classics Edition. It's short. You can read all of his poems in like a day. There's 116 of them, and they take up maybe 75 pages in English. If you might be familiar with some of them, like the Odette Amo, I hate and I love, and why this is, you might ask, I can't tell, but I feel it happening and I'm tormented. I mean, it's that kind of just like highly relatable, almost like pop song, love song stuff. And again, like once you get into it, it's not snoozy ancient literature. It's very vital and vivid. So if you haven't read Catullus in a while, you've never read Catullus, read Catullus.
Well, definitely for me, something I cannot recommend. I finally got a chance to watch Gladiator 2, and that was just a huge, massive disappointment. I mean, I wasn't surprised because, I mean, Ridley Scott, you have Napoleon, you have this. He's not been doing too well lately. So that one, absolutely do not watch. But I'm also still going through Gene Hackman movies, just finished up The Quick and the Dead, which okay, Sharon Stone, awful, but Gene Hackman is really good in that movie. You have Russell Crowe, you've got a 21-year-old Leonardo DiCaprio, and some other great cast members too. Gary Sinise shows up for a little bit, so really good kind of all-star cast movie. Sam Raimi directs it, and it's very hokey, very over the top, but I always enjoyed that movie. I've seen it 20, 25 times, I'm sure, probably. Other great Gene Hackman movies I want to watch again, The Conversation, which is a masterpiece. That one's phenomenal. David Mamet, Heist, I definitely want to watch that again. His movies are always very worthwhile to watch. So going to, continue my Gene Hackman run.
Yeah, for those who've been living under a rock, a 90-something-year-old, 95, I think Gene Hackman was found dead in his home with his wife last week. So very sad, but people should honor his memory by watching some of his great performances, including The French Connection, which all of you know well. But if you haven't watched it, go watch it. I've actually never watched The Conversation, Mike, but it's been on the list forever.
Oh, yeah, you got to get to it. It's fantastic.
Mike, I'll send you my review of Gladiator. I think you'll get a kick out of it. That was quite a flop.
I would just like to add one item to the Gene Hackman oeuvre that I would recommend not watching, which is Runaway Jury, which I tried to start watching, and I knew it was a John Grisham movie, and I mean, they tend to be really kind of bad. This one is so silly, it doesn't make any sense at all, where Gene Hackman plays a jury consultant where they get like tens of millions of dollars basically to survey all of the jurors and then follow them during the trial and try to impact what they do, say like buying the company that they work for and subtly trying to alter their opinion. I couldn't really get through more than 20 or 30 minutes of it, but it was pretty bad. So that's all I have to say.
That's good. The book's better, as I recall, but that's usually the case with the plot boilers. I mean, if you're a Grisham fan, my favorite Grisham novel is still The Client, the classic one. And then the last recommendation, I just wanted to flag it. I don't know if we've mentioned it before, but my wife bought me a subscription as a present, and that is Walter Kern's Journalistic Venture, which is a bi-monthly, old school, no color newspaper called County Highway, which has a wonderful mix of some national news reporting and then essays and some literary stuff, including some lengthy reviews of fiction you might not run across otherwise. It's very Walter Kernian in spirit, and I've been enjoying it quite a lot. So go check out County Highway. And with that, thank you all for listening to another episode of The Roundtable. If you want to learn more about the Claremont Institute's work, go to www.claremont.org/donate if you'd like to support our work. View our publications, AmericanMind.org or ClaremontReviewBooks.com. Brand new issue out online for ClaremontReviewBooks.com, including our senior editor Bill Vogley's take on what next for the Democratic Party after their loss. And then if you want to see our latest work out of our Washington, D.C. Center, go to dc.claremont.org. And if you like the show, rate it well and subscribe, pass along word. And thank you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.